Christmas Eve, Cardiff, Wales.
Ambulance, what's full address of the emergency?
Hi. I need an ambulance to my house.
Okay, what's the address?
It's Lander.
Okay, is the patient awake?
No, I think no. What? My friend.
Okay, is he breathing?
No, he's not. He's dead.
Mate, come towards me. Come towards me.
The ambulance.
Where in there is he? Where in there is he?
Okay, mate. I don't know what's happening. I'm going to handcuff.
Wait. Where are we going then? Wait. In here?
Inside the property, the police found a scene from their darkest nightmares and stood there, claiming he had acted in self-defence, had been the best friend of the victim, and a man who had also been the heir to an over £200 million fortune.
Okay, so the time is 12:10, right? I'm now further arresting you on suspicion of murder, okay?
Before we explore this case any further, my name's Joshua Miles and I cover lesser-known true crime cases from all corners of the world here on my YouTube channel. If you think that's something you'd be interested in, then please subscribe to this channel so you don't miss out on any true crime cases. Now, with that being said, let's dive straight into the case of William Bush. William Kenneth Bush was born on Saturday the 12th of February in the year 2000 to parents John and Liz Bush. He also had two siblings, Catherine and Alex. He was described by those who knew him as someone who was well loved by all. He was compassionate, vibrant, though was by nature a quiet and passive man who shied away from conflict. At the age of 13, Will became a student at Christ College in Brecon in Wales. It was there that he met another boy who had been in the same schoolhouse as him and who would go on to become his best friend, Dylan Thomas. Dylan Thomas had been born on the 30th of June in the year 2000 to parents Scott Thomas and Kirsty Howells. His father, Scott Thomas, had been a member of a prominent Welsh business dynasty. The Thomas family's wealth, estimated at approximately 200 million Great British pounds in 2013, had originated from a pie business that was established by Scott Thomas's grandfather, a man called Stanley Thomas. Scott Thomas was also the nephew of Peter Thomas, who had at one point been the chairman of the Cardiff Rugby Club. Stanley Thomas, Scott's grandfather, laid the foundation for the family's fortune by starting this pie business. And this business, which was initially known as Thomas's Pies in the 1950s, sold sausage rolls, pies, and pasties throughout the South Wales valleys. By the 1970s, it had evolved into Peter's Pies and is currently known as Peter's Food, which is based in Bedwas. In 1988, Stanley Thomas Jr., who is Scott's father, so he had the same name as Scott's grandfather, and Peter Thomas sold the company to Grander Metropolitan, and they sold it for a price in excess of £95 million, which would be just shy of £260 million in today's money, or about $327 million US. Stan Thomas, Scott's father, then significantly expanded the family's business interests. He expanded the business empire to include TBI, which was a company that owned Cardiff Airport from 1995 to 2013. TBI also owned airports in Belfast and Orlando, alongside managing services at other airports such as Luton. This diversification substantially increased the family's wealth. In his own business ventures, Scott Thomas launched a bar called Scott's, which was based in Cardiff's city centre. However, the bar only remained open for less than 2 years, closing in 1999 after a tragedy struck. A 35-year-old man by the name of Stuart David fell 18 feet to his death from a balcony at the venue during a Christmas party. In January of 2003, Scott Thomas faced legal consequences for assaulting his former girlfriend, Kirsty Howells, and we know that she was the mother of Dylan Thomas. The incident occurred at his luxury home in the Old St Mellons area of Cardiff. Scott Thomas admitted to the assault at Cardiff Crown Court, and he was actually sentenced to 6 months in jail for that. During the court proceedings, it was revealed that Kirsty Howells had sustained cuts and bruises to her face and neck as a result of the attack. Scott's defense, a man called Roger Thomas, stated that his client was genuinely remorseful and upset about what had occurred. Quick side note, unclear whether this Roger Thomas was related to the Thomas dynasty or not, but it wouldn't surprise me if he was like a cousin. But also the Thomas surname is quite popular. It's quite commonplace in Wales. So, you know, there may or may not be a link there. I couldn't figure out whether that was or not. But he had mentioned that numerous people, including celebrities, had offered support to Scott Thomas. Scott's father, Stan Thomas, pleaded on behalf of his son, emphasizing that Scott was always the center of attention. However, the judge determines that imprisonment was the most effective punishment for someone of Scott's background, and I agree. Kirsty Howells, Dylan's mother, had been 31 years old when the attack had happened. She had been an international model who had been signed to a world-famous modeling agency called Elite, and had worked with Naomi Campbell and Claudia Schiffer, strutting the runways of places like Milan, Paris, and New York. She actually ended up starting her own modeling agency and modeling school to, quote, teach up-and-coming models about professionalism and pitfalls within the industry. When Dylan Thomas had been born in the year 2000, he'd actually been born in Jersey, which is where he lived until the age of 1, which was when he moved to Cardiff with his family. And at the age of 3, his parents separated following that domestic abuse case, which is understandable, and that saw his mother Kirsty move to Sussex after a while. It is also important to note that much later on, as he grew up and everything, his parents were all over the place and weren't really around that much from what I can tell, but just so you know the context there. When Dylan had met William Bush at Christ College, Brecon, when they had been about 13 years old, Dylan was described as being more reserved, whereas William Bush was described as outgoing and sociable. There isn't all too much information available about their time at school. What we do know is that after finishing school, both William Bush and Dylan Thomas applied for university. Dylan Thomas was offered a place, but he didn't end up going to university and actually turned down the opportunity. Will Bush was offered a place at Oxford Brookes University, and he went on to study real estate management from 2018 to 2021. It's unclear what their relationship was like while Will Bush had been at university, but it must have stayed fairly positive, as after Will graduated, the two friends moved in together. Will had found a job as a graduate rating surveyor at Cook and Arkwright in Cardiff, which was a position he started in September of 2021, which just so happened to have been ideal for the friends, as Dylan Thomas's grandparents owned a property called Ty Matthew in Cardiff. The two friends subsequently moved into the house with the agreement that Will pay Dylan Thomas rent on a monthly basis, though this rent would be reduced if Will had provided lifts to Dylan or he had bought items for the house. When Will's brother would later be asked about Will's time in Cardiff, he would note, quote, I think Will liked it in Cardiff. He liked having his own space. It was close enough to Brecon to come home. It's a nice city. There are things going on, things to do. Will was further described as, quote, Will was a loving son, brother, partner, and friend. He was well loved by all who knew him. He was by nature a quiet and passive man who shied away from confrontation. He was fit and muscular. He was athletic, a keen golfer, and on occasion played golf for his county. Dylan was described as having very few friends and was, quote, regarded as something of a loner. His grandmother would describe Dylan as a quiet person, with his only real friend being Will Bush. Not only would the two of them share Ty Matthew and live there together, they would also go on holiday together with Dylan and his family. And whilst the two of them shared the facilities of the house, it must be noted that, of course, Will had exclusive usage of his own bedroom, and that each of them catered for and cleared up after themselves. Like, they were to some degree still independent of each other. But that's not to say that they both didn't spend a lot of time together. They would play golf together, go out together in the evening, and Will would try to support Dylan in every way he could. As we know, he would regularly drive Dylan to any place that he wanted to go, as Dylan couldn't drive. Will's brother would later recount, quote, Will had lots of friends. He's very popular. He was caring, perhaps too caring at times, loyal, extremely loyal. In terms of their relationship, I don't know how you would describe that. They would go on holidays together, not just holidays families paid for. I know they went skiing together. I think Will felt kind of sorry for him being Dylan, and wanted to be there for him. I'm not sure what Dylan's plans were, but if Will came back home for Sunday lunch or to play golf, he would make sure to get back because Dylan was on his own. He was just caring. Now, there had been a dog that had been living at Ty Matthew by the name of Bruce that had belonged to Dylan's mother. However, Dylan's mother hadn't wanted to look after the dog and had initially left this dog with Dylan's brother before it came to live with Dylan at Ty Matthew. It appeared, however, that Will ended up being more responsible for this dog. William would walk Bruce a lot, and Dylan would often not be at home to look after the dog. Quote, Will loves dogs, so he's not going to want to leave the dog in the house on his own. Dylan was described as being, quote, young for his age, and that there had been, quote, a couple of girls in his life, but There'd been no girlfriends that he'd brought home. Will, on the other hand, had met a woman by the name of Sophie. It must be noted that I've changed this person's name for the purpose of privacy protection, and I've used a fake name to protect their privacy. Sophie and Will had met each other at work and had known each other for about 2 years before they started to date one another. Quote, "It's just been the best relationship. We made each other happy and laugh. We'd been on holidays and had so much planned." And Will and Sophie's relationship had begun to progress, especially in the lead up to the Christmas period of 2023. And this subsequently saw the dynamics of Will and Dylan's relationship begin to change. Dylan and Will had been living together at Tymathy for about 2 years when, in around October of 2023, after Will Bush had been on a period of about a month's sick leave due to his suffering from migraines and nausea, Will decided to leave his job and look for another job. He had hoped to start a new, less stressful job in the new year, and he'd been in discussions with his girlfriend Sophie about potentially looking for their own place to live. Sophie would later state that Will had gone to the hospital with these migraines to try to get medical help. Quote, "He had really bad anxiety as well. He would start shaking, being sick." Sophie noted that since leaving the job, Will would still have headaches, but he wouldn't suffer from migraines as often. While Will had been employed, he had paid Dylan rent for his room at Tymathy, but Dylan actually waived this rent after Will had left his job. That wasn't to say that Will didn't pull his weight though, as he continued to frequently help Dylan out by taking on the majority of the responsibility when it came to looking after the dog, and continued to act like a personal chauffeur to Dylan, giving him lifts around in his car. Now, it must be noted that in the months leading up to December of 2023, Dylan Thomas had been acting in what was described as strange and erratic ways, behaviour that had given cause for concern for Will Bush about Dylan's mental health. On Friday the 3rd of November 2023, Dylan flew to Turkey completely out of the blue without telling anyone and all on his own. Sophie, Will's girlfriend, would later recount that Will had told her that he was concerned about Dylan after Dylan had said that he wanted to go to Gaza and Basra to, quote, "see what it's like," though she was unable to confirm whether or not Dylan had actually gone to Gaza. When Dylan would later be asked about this trip, he stated that he went to Istanbul as he had, quote, "wanted to go on holiday." But a few days into the trip, Dylan had decided to go back home, and he ended up going back home via Rome as it had apparently been less expensive. Dylan arrived back from Turkey on Monday the 6th of November 2023, and he went straight to Buckingham Palace. Dylan Thomas tried to climb a 14-metre fence at Buckingham Palace, and he was subsequently rugby tackled to the ground after Dylan failed to respond to the instructions from the armed police that responded to him, and they were just asking him to get on the floor. Now, interestingly, in Dylan's mind, he had climbed that fence and had gotten into Buckingham Palace, but that wasn't the case. He never got inside Buckingham Palace at all. Dylan told the police that he was trying to explore the energy pattern between Buckingham Palace and Cleopatra's Needle. He would later state that he thought it had been a silly thing to do, but that he believed that the officers that had attended when he'd climbed the fence knew what he was thinking about and could hear his thoughts. A forensic psychologist would later state, quote, "I've spoken to him a couple times about his experience. He said he believed the officers could see his thoughts. That, in my view, is a psychotic symptom." We're going to be exploring the psychiatric testimony later on in this video, but I thought it critical to establish that context first. It's also important to note that Dylan had also planned to visit the Church of Scientology in London and had even made an appointment with them when he'd gotten back from Turkey, but when he got to London, he decided it had been more worthwhile to check the, quote, "energy field between Buckingham Palace and Cleopatra's Needle." When Will had found out about what had happened at Buckingham Palace, he confided in his girlfriend Sophie. She would later recall that Will had told her that he'd asked Dylan why he'd done what he'd done, to which Dylan had said, quote, "he wanted to see what the consequences would be of doing it." Now, Dylan had been due to appear in court in February of 2024 for this attempted trespassing at Buckingham Palace. A couple of weeks later, after that Buckingham Palace attempted break-in, there'd also been an event that Will had told his girlfriend Sophie about, in which Will claims that Dylan had told him that Dylan was wondering about what it would be like to kill Will. Will was so freaked out by this that he actually ended up barricading himself into his bedroom, and he hid there as he heard Dylan try to unsuccessfully enter the bedroom. Sophie would later testify, quote, "there was something wrong with Dylan. He wasn't himself. There were a few weapons in the house they could use if anyone broke in. They have a couple of things in the house. I know Dylan had bought a samurai sword in Austria in January of 2023. There's also a couple of BB guns. There may be other knives and stuff. On Saturday the 23rd of December 2023, Will and his girlfriend decided to go Christmas shopping. They then returned back to Ty Matthew, where Will and Dylan had lived, shortly before Dylan had left. Dylan told them both that he was going to go stay with his aunt before agreeing to Will looking after Dylan's dog and informing them that he'd be back on Boxing Day to pick the dog up. Dylan then proceeded to give Will and Sophie a hug, wish them a Merry Christmas, and then left. At around 5:30 p.m. that day, Will took his girlfriend home and dropped her off before returning back to Ty Matthew, where he intended to spend the night alone and look after the dog. That would be the last time that Sophie would see her boyfriend Will alive. He had made plans to join his family in Brecon the following day on Christmas Eve for the Christmas celebrations. That evening, Dylan Thomas went out for a meal with his family to a pub called the Miskin Arms. It must be noted that there had been no plans for Dylan to have stayed that night with his grandmother, but it had been during that evening that he had told his grandmother that he was feeling lonely and depressed, and so she had told him, quote, "Coming down with me then for a while," to which Dylan agreed to do so. His grandmother would later state, quote, "He was his usual quiet self. We came back to the house, it wasn't late, and Dylan went to bed. I went on my iPad and poured myself a glass of wine. He came down a couple times. I said, 'Are you okay?' He said, 'Fine, fine.'" Dylan didn't expand on how he was feeling to his grandmother, but evidence detailed that it had been on that morning that he'd performed a number of searches on the internet that were indicative of suicidal feelings. As the night progressed on the 23rd of December into the following morning, Dylan and Will exchanged several messages on Snapchat. Dylan asked Will if he'd left a key for him, to which Will responded at 11:04 p.m, quote, "Yeah, sorry lad, only just seen my phone, I'm here still." At 18 minutes past midnight, Dylan replied to Will saying, quote, "Okay, nice." It was at around the same time that Dylan started searching on the internet for, quote, veins and arteries in the wrist. 18 minutes later, Dylan pulled up an image on the search results that detailed the location of jugular veins. At 1:29 a.m, Dylan searched, quote, "Reap what you sow." And then at 2:24 a.m, Dylan sent a message to Will that read, quote, "What time are you leaving tomorrow?" Just shy of 20 minutes later, Dylan sent Will another message that said, quote, "I need to see you before you leave the house tomorrow. Let me know what time you go." William Bush would reply to Will a few hours later at 5:37 a.m. with, quote, "Leaving a bit later on, mate." To which Dylan stated, "Okay, no worries." It's interesting to note that Dylan had searched for a taxi or Uber twice during the night. Firstly at 3:31 a.m. and again at 8:54 a.m. And that was an Uber or taxi to Ty Matthew from his grandmother's house. As the morning eased into 9 a.m, Dylan went into his grandmother's bedroom and told her that he hadn't been able to sleep the entire night. Quote, "He came in this morning, probably around 9 a.m. I just got out of the shower. He came in and hadn't slept at all." Dylan's grandmother went to make him a hot drink and fetch him an over-the-counter sleeping tablet as Dylan stepped out onto the balcony. The weather had been described as horrendous as Dylan stood there, seemingly unfazed on this balcony. His grandmother understandably was concerned and told him to come back inside and told him that she was going to leave him alone for a few hours so that he could get some sleep. She said, quote, "The weather was horrific. I said, 'What are you doing? Come in.' I locked the door. I said, 'I've made you Ovaltine. Go to bed for a few hours.' I gave him Nitol. He said, 'I'm really, really tired.'" However, Dylan instead quickly got up and went down to the kitchen where he told his grandmother that he had to go back home to Ty Matthew. Dylan's grandmother asked him why, to which Dylan told her that he needed to go back on account of his dog. Dylan's grandmother initially told Dylan to ask her partner to take him back home, but he had been unavailable, so she ended up agreeing to take him. Now, during a half-hour period between 9:53 a.m. and 10:20 a.m, Dylan made a multitude of internet searches that were indicative of him having suicidal thoughts. At 10:22 a.m, Dylan messaged Will, quote, "You home?" Will replied to him just a few minutes later with, quote, "Yeah, I'm home." Dylan then proceeded to call Will a few times, with Will not initially picking up the phone. Eventually, Dylan got through and he spoke on the phone with Will. The exact conversation that Dylan and Will had that morning is known only to Dylan, a conversation which he hasn't revealed, at least not on the public record. At 10:41 a.m, Dylan's grandmother drove Dylan to Ty Matthew. When asked about Dylan's state during this drive, his grandmother said, quote, "He was agitated and extremely quiet. On the way up, the traffic was crazy on the road. I said, 'Will be ages and ages and ages.' I asked him where his key was and he said only Will had got it. I said about going to get keys cut. He said he had keys in the house. I said, 'Why have you got them on you?' They arrived and parked at the back of the property at about 11:16 a.m. Throughout the drive over to the house, Dylan's grandmother noted that Dylan appeared to have been jumpy and wound up. Quote, "As we got to Culver House Cross, his legs started jumping. I put my hand on him and said, quote, 'Why are you so wound up?' And he said, 'No reason.' I said, do you want Will living there? Because I knew Will had lost his job for months and he wasn't paying his keep, and I know they weren't keeping the house tidy. I felt Dylan was really concerned and worried about something, and he's quite quiet, so it's very difficult. Dylan insisted to his grandmother that he was fine and that he just needed to take the dog out, which is strange due to the fact that Dylan knew that Will had been at the house and that Will had been perfectly capable of taking the dog out. In fact, he'd asked him to look after the dog that night so he could go and stay at his family. So that was a lie. When they arrived at the property, Dylan's grandmother stayed in the car as Dylan got out. He told his grandmother that he would be no longer than 10 minutes, and in the 10 minutes that followed, Dylan would murder his best friend, William Bush. Dylan used 2 knives, a flick knife and a kitchen knife, to inflict 37 stab wounds alongside further sharp force injuries to his supposed best friend, William Bush. He stabbed him repeatedly in the neck, head, chest, and back. The truth of what really happened in Ty Matthew that day is known only to Dylan, but a sequence of likely events was inferred from the evidence. It is believed that the attack on William Bush commenced in his bedroom, before it continued down the stairs, into the kitchen, and then onto the patio. Quote, Dylan Thomas made his way into the property. He entered through the kitchen, where he armed himself with a large kitchen knife and a black lock knife or flick knife, then proceeded to go up the 2 staircases and into the room of William Bush. Will Bush was attacked from behind, probably with the flick knife, as Will Bush was sat or stood near to a beanbag. He was stabbed at least once to the back of the neck. This attack finally came to an end on the stairs that led up to the carport, all as William Bush tried to escape from Dylan. It had been in the kitchen where William had suffered the most serious of the injuries inflicted upon him. Dylan repeatedly stabbed Will Bush in the back of the neck, his head, the front of his neck, and to the chest. He further cut Will's throat and severed the major artery in the neck. It was determined that Will's blood had been located on the underside of the kitchen drawer, where they kept the same kitchen knife that was involved in the attack. That suggested, in a desperate attempt to fend off Dylan's ensuing attack, Will may have picked up that knife. And it was clear that he was able to at least defend himself, even just for a moment, and somehow get a hold of a knife, as he had inflicted cuts to Dylan's hands. Will fought back, or at least that's what the evidence implies. Will then continued to try to escape, making his way through the sliding doors in the kitchen and to the patio. Unfortunately, Will had been seriously injured by that point and was seen by passers-by lying on the patio, collapsed in a large pool of blood. Passers-by to the property heard screams and cries for help. One witness would later state, quote, I was leaving Coffee Lab on Llandaff High Street. As we got to the car park, I was with my sister, brother and wife. We heard someone shouting, help me. We walked back to where the sound was coming from and looked over the fence. There was a man on all fours and there was a lot of blood. There was a silver kitchen knife, stainless steel. I don't know if he was holding that. He was on all fours and there was someone in the French windows. They seemed to get up and scuffle. I got away. My wife said, get away. I phoned you, the police, up. And that's pretty much everything I saw. Now, according to reports, with the flick knife in his hand, Dylan calmly and relentlessly followed Will out onto the patio. It was suspected that Dylan then used both the flick knife and the kitchen knife, which he had picked up from the ground, to continue his attack on Will, stabbing him over and over and over again. Dylan then stopped and he walked over to his grandmother, who had still been in the car, and told her that he had killed William Bush in self-defense. Now, if you cast your mind back just a few moments where we talked about those defensive wounds that Dylan had on his hands, the reason why it's unclear whether those were inflicted or not was because Dylan went with this self-defense thing, and it could be possible that he had done that to himself in order to give that more of that illusion, but it's unclear. The general consensus was that at some point, Will did fight back. Dylan's grandmother would later state that she'd been on the telephone to her youngest daughter during that 10 minutes when this had all happened. Quotes, no more than 5 minutes later, I heard the car door being banged, and all I could hear was, it's gone crazy, or he's gone crazy. I jumped out and Dylan was just covered in blood and practically falling down on the floor. I ran into the house. I could see Will on the floor and straight away I started to do CPR on him. I didn't stop until the ambulance people came. I thought I felt a pulse, but I don't know because my adrenaline was so crazy. I cut off my daughter and handed the phone. I tried to dial 999. I called Dylan and told him to ring police and ambulance, and that's what he did. Dylan's grandmother did everything she could for William as she waited for the emergency services to arrive. One of the passers-by, a man by the name of John Ivans, had made a 999 call at 11:24 a.m. He said, quote, police, I think someone has been stabbed with a knife. I can see him and hear him now. Yes, a knife, a kitchen knife, carving knife. Dylan himself made a call to the emergency services using his grandmother's phone at 11:32 a.m.
Ambulance, was full address the emergency.
Hi. I need an ambulance to my house.
Okay, what's the address?
It's Lander.
Okay, is the patient awake?
No, well, no, I think, no. Well, my friend, he's...
Okay, is he breathing?
No, he's not, he's dead.
The police arrived on the scene at 11:36 a.m., followed closely by ambulances and paramedics.
Mate, come towards me. Come towards me.
The ambulance.
Where in there is he? Where in there is he?
Okay, mate, I don't know what's happening at the moment. I'm going to handcuff.
Wait. Where are we going? Wait. In here?
When the paramedics had arrived at Ty Matthew at 11:45 a.m., they found William Bush on the steps near the patio in cardiac arrest. His neck was described as, quote, basically shredded, and there were lacerations across the trachea which were exposed. At 12:10 p.m., 10 minutes after midday, William Bush was sadly pronounced dead at the scene, and consequently, Dylan Thomas was arrested on suspicion of murder.
So the time is 12:10, right? I'm now further arresting you on suspicion of murder, okay? So you remain under caution, so you do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defence if you don't mention when questioned. Don't put you later around in court, anything you do say may be given evidence, okay?
Following Dylan's arrest, he made a handful of comments to the officers that were notable. Dylan told the officers that when he had last had contact with the police, they had tried to plant cocaine on him. Further, he asked the officers, quote, what species are we? And he asked the officers if they identified as a, quote, monkey or shapeshifter. Dylan Thomas was taken to the University Hospital of Wales in Cardiff, where he made further comments. He said, quote, I killed him. He came at me and I stabbed him. I stabbed him. He attacked me. It was self-defense. He attacked me. He was having an episode. It has been happening for months. Dylan was returned to police custody and an attempt was made to interview him, but it was quickly determined that his mental state was not adequate enough for an interview to take place. A post-mortem was conducted on the 25th of December, and it found that there had been multiple sharp injuries to the front, sides, and back of the neck, and the front and back of the trunk. We're not going to go into the specifics of the autopsy findings out of respect, and I feel like we've touched a lot, and you can gather from what I've said how horrific the attack had been. But what it did find was that the cause of death was determined to have been due to multiple stab wounds to the neck and trunk. Now, at trial, Dylan did not seek to maintain at trial this false claim of self-defense. He kind of like shifted gears, and he actually ended up pleading guilty to manslaughter on the basis of diminished responsibility. And that's what the trial was for, to try and figure out whether it had been murder or whether it had been manslaughter on the basis of diminished responsibility. Now, the trial against Dylan commenced in November of 2024. The defense for Dylan relied on the evidence of Dr. Panshu Xavier, who was a consultant forensic pathologist that worked at the Ashworth Hospital in Liverpool, which is where Dylan had been held that entire time, since he was arrested. The prosecution established that there had been no doubt that prior to the killing on Christmas Eve, Dylan was beginning to suffer from psychosis, and it was revealed that following the murder, Dylan's condition worsened, and as a result, he was receiving treatment for schizophrenia at the hospital. Quote, Dr. Xavier was asked to consider whether, in his view, the attack on William Bush was a psychotic episode. He concluded that he thought it was. However, he points out that this was not a case where Dylan heard voices instructing him to do what he did. It was a case where the doctor believed that at the end of October and into November of 2023, Dylan had suffered from at least one hallucination in that he believed that William Bush had threatened to drink his spinal fluid. Though this alleged hallucination had not been supported by Dylan, as he had told the psychiatrist that he believed that this event had actually occurred and that it hadn't been a hallucination. The prosecution had instructed a different forensic psychiatrist by the name of Dylan Jayawik Rama, and Dylan had maintained this stance to both the psychiatrists that it had not been a hallucination. The prosecution told the court in their opening statement, quote, the difference between the two doctors relates to what happened at the time of the killing. Mr. Jayawik Rama is of the opinion that when you look at the evidence as a whole, it demonstrates that this defendant, Dylan, did know exactly what he was doing. It is the view of Mr. Jayawik Rama that even where a man is suffering from psychotic illness, that does not necessarily mean that the psychosis has caused the act complained of. Basically saying that he knew what he was doing, he knew that he could distinguish right from wrong. His psychosis was not the driving factor of why it happened, if that makes sense. It couldn't be explained. Throughout this trial, a multitude of witness testimony was heard, and we've actually already touched on a lot of that witness testimony in this video already, and that was testimony from Will's girlfriend Sophie, Will's brother Alex, from Dylan's grandmother, from witnesses to the murder, and from the first responders. What I'd like to focus on from the trial is the psychiatric state that Dylan had been in, predominantly as it had made up his defense that he had been guilty of manslaughter on this account of diminished responsibility. When Dr. Panshu Xavier was asked asked about Dylan's mental state, he confirms that there can be no question that Dylan Thomas had been psychotic, but the area of dispute was as to what time had there been an area of psychosis. Dr. Xavier was then asked about Dylan having schizophrenia, quote, "I can offer an explanation. Schizophrenia tends to be a genetic condition. It does tend to run in families. If there is a history someone in your family has got it, you're more likely to get it. If you have stresses or drug use, they can make you more likely to have a psychotic illness." Dylan Thomas had been through a lot of stressful situations, and that can precipitate some of the symptoms described. When he was asked about whether there had been any significance to Dylan asking for an ambulance for himself, Dr. Xavier said, "This was a man consumed by the fact that he had been attacked and he had to retaliate. That's what he's saying in the back of the van, and it's not unusual to think he needed help for himself." Further, Dr. Xavier said that Dylan had been under the belief that he was going to be attacked or killed. Drawings and letters addressed to Elon Musk were passed to the doctor from Dylan, alongside downloads from his phone. We'll touch on that again in just a minute. Dr. Xavier proceeded to confirm that Dylan had been in a psychotic state when he had been admitted to Ashworth Hospital, and that he'd been on antipsychotic medication, and that his condition had improved, but he was not completely clear of symptoms. He added, quote, "It's not uncommon for people with psychosis arming themselves with weapons if they believe they are going to be harmed. Dylan Thomas believed in some way he was going to be harmed. That's his account." Dr. Xavier explained that Dylan had tried to remove his clothes inappropriately when he had been in custody and had made comments about, quote, "someone being an ape." He indicated that these were all indications of him being psychotic. Dr. Xavier stated that it was recognized by his family that Dylan was, quote, "changing," but that his psychotic symptoms would not be obvious to a layperson. Quote, "It's my view he was psychotic way before the offense, but it wouldn't have been obvious to lay people that he was." The initial history given to Dr. Xavier detailed how Dylan had been working on virtual reality headset accessories, in particular waterproof accessories that he had been developing when he had been arrested. Dylan also didn't report any psychiatric history, but there had been a reference to a maternal grandparent having mental illness. Now, the possibility of substances or alcohol having a role in the murder was explored, and it must be noted that there were reports that weed was used in the property, but predominantly by William Bush. And Dylan, when asked, did reveal that he had taken LSD in the past and had used weed in the past. But it was of Dr. Xavier's view that substances and alcohol had not played a part in what had happened. The defense for Dylan then asked Dr. Xavier if there had been anything to suggest that the killing took place because Will and his girlfriend had been planning to leave and look for a new flat. Dr. Xavier stated that it had not been his view and that Dylan hadn't mentioned it being relevant to why he did what he did. Now, there had been another event in the months prior to the murder in which Dylan had claimed to have heard, quote, "a loud, high-pitched squeaking from the escalators in Primark," which is a fast fashion chain clothing store. Dylan had been so upset by this loud noise that he'd gone to the nearest solicitor's office in order to, quote, "sue Primark." According to Dylan, this ringing in his ears continued for a number of days. Dr. Xavier stated about this, quote, "That sounds psychotic to me. To Dylan Thomas, it was real." Now, I want to go back a bit and touch on something I very briefly mentioned a few moments ago, particularly the drawings and letters that Dylan had written and made for Elon Musk. As you may have gathered, especially from what happened at Buckingham Palace, Dylan's state of mind had led him to believe a multitude of conspiracy theories, and these conspiracy theories were brought up during the trial. When Will Bush's girlfriend Sophie was asked whether Dylan had spoken about conspiracy theories surrounding, quote, "the Illuminati and the Rothschilds," she said no. When she was asked if he had mentioned Cleopatra's Needle or Elon Musk, she also replied no. But when she was asked if Dylan had told her that he could solve the energy crisis by using a magnet, she said that it rang a bell, and that the only other conspiracy theory that she could recall had been that Dylan had told her that he had solved gravity. Dylan's grandmother was also questioned about whether Dylan had spoken about conspiracy theories, and she said that he'd mentioned something about teleportation, but that she didn't understand. She stated that Dylan had tried to explain it, but she just didn't understand. Interestingly, Dylan's family hadn't been aware of the incident that had occurred at Buckingham Palace or of the events that had happened at Primark. His grandmother confirms that Dylan was a very private person, and it was hard to get him out of his shell. Going back to the forensic psychologist, Dr. Xavier, he stated that the incident that had occurred at Buckingham Palace, in which Dylan claims that he believed the officers could see his thoughts, could have been the first time that an intervention could have happened. Though Dr. Xavier explained there may have been, quote, bias from clinicians, as Dylan had been articulate and had dressed well. Dr. Xavier told the court that Dylan had said that he'd created a, quote, fishing fission device, and he believed that he could use gravitational force to, quote, enhance unlimited energy for humankind. When Dylan had been arrested at Buckingham Palace, he had told the officers, quote, I'm over now, so you may as well show me Buckingham Palace. This indicated, according to Dr. Xavier, that Dylan hadn't understood the gravity of what he'd done and was under some of the psychotic symptoms he was experiencing. The drawings that he'd created detailed a, quote, space taxi and this, quote, fusion fission device. When asked about this device, Dylan described it as a set of magnets, a layer of gases, and a hot ball of plasma which could, quote, enhance energy for humankind. According to Dr. Xavier, Dylan had been consumed by these thoughts in the run-up to December of 2023 when the murder had happened. Further, Dylan hadn't changed his belief, and at the time of the trial, he still believed that he had this ability to create this device. Dylan had also made reference to teleporters and the Illuminati to Dr. Xavier, and I made a list of goals which had included the words job, freedom, health, girlfriend, wife, kids. The message that Dylan had sent to Elon Musk had been titled Gravity and had read, quote, Dear Mr. Musk, once you solve gravity, you can solve everything else. Have learnt everything about everything in a short period of 5 months. Dylan had wanted to offer up these technologies that he'd come up with to Elon Musk. Dr. Xavier stated, quote, Clearly what this has allowed me to understand was his thinking. He was convinced he could do these things in the letter to Elon Musk. These were grandiose illusions to create or invent this machine. He said he could understand anti-gravity and, quote, me and you could join forces to create these unlimited quantities of energy. He believed it. He clearly believed he could carry out what he put down on paper. This is clearly psychotic. It's important to note that Dr. Xavier said that he did not think it possible for someone of Dylan's academic ability to understand gravity and quantum physics in the space of a few months. When Dylan and Dr. Xavier spoke about the incident in which Dylan had claims that Will Bush had said to him that he wanted to drink his spinal fluid, Dr. Xavier said, quote, he said he was going to play golf with his friend. Will Bush was driving the car. Dylan was sat next to him and he believes he hears Will saying, quote, I want to drink your spinal fluid. Ultimately, Dr. Xavier returned back to the murder and explained Dylan had responded to what he perceived to have been a threat on his life. His perception had been altered by his psychosis and that there had likely been no actual threat. Quote, this was his best friend since the age of 13. Dylan still holds on to the view he did this in self-defense. The alternative is he needs to accept he's taken someone's life. He will continue to hold on to this to save his life because he could turn inwards and want to end his life because he's taken someone's life. Dr. Xavier also, and a little oddly in my not educationally backed opinion, stated that there had been, quote, no significance to the fact that Dylan had washed his hands before he had called for the police. Dr. Xavier added, quote, he felt threatened by his best friend and responded in the manner that he did with a knife. My view is he is describing what he believed happened and why it happened. The defense then asked Dr. Xavier the following question. Was Dylan Thomas suffering from an abnormality of function at the time of the offense? Dr. Xavier said, correct. That is my view. Schizophrenia. Cross-examination of Dr. Xavier by the prosecution started with Dr. Xavier confirming that people who are psychotic do not necessarily commit criminal offences, and that they have the ability to plan and conform intent. The prosecution stated, quote, the actual killing may have provided a cliff edge which deteriorated to the state he was at the police station. Dr. Xavier responded, that does not take away from the fact that he was unwell for many months. Quote, he has not given me an explanation for me to understand why he did what he did that day. His actions would suggest he was determined to end Will Bush's life. What drove that, in my view, is his psychosis. Concluding his evidence, Dr. Xavier said, quote, my view is very clear in my report that he was psychotic before, and I have no doubt he has schizophrenia. In their closing statements, the prosecution stated, quote, you may have wondered what is the motive. It's a matter of law. The prosecution does not have to provide a motive. Sometimes offences are committed where there is no motive or where, as in this case, we suggest the motive is hidden. It may arise from numerous factors coming to a crescendo and cause a sudden loss of temper leading to extreme violence. That is what we submit probably happened here. We do not accept Dylan Thomas's mental function was so substantially affected as to precipitate this violence against Will Bush because there was no trigger. The prosecution asked of the court that if Dylan Thomas was suffering psychosis, that William Bush was going to kill him, then why on earth did he go to the house on his own accord? Why did he look up those taxis? Why did he insist to go to this house? There'd been no real reason for him to have gone to that house that morning unless he had an ulterior motive. The prosecution concluded their closing speech. We submit is for the defense to prove this defendant's mental function was substantially affected so as to cause him to commit this crime. We submit with respect the defense failed to charge that burden, even on the balance of probability, because there is no trigger here. And therefore, although it's no pleasure to me to say it, this young man is guilty of murder, and we invite you to convict him of it. On day 7 of the trial, after the judge had finished summing up the case, the jury retired to consider its verdict. And by 2:05 p.m., a verdict had been reached. Despite his plea, the jury rejected Dylan's defense, and found him guilty of murder. He appeared via a video link as the verdict was read out, and he appeared emotionless. The sentencing for Dylan then had to be determined, and the sentencing remarks were posted on the 24th of January 2025. For the murder of William Bush, Dylan Thomas was sentenced to life imprisonment. The minimum term imposed was 17 years and 337 days imprisonment.
William Bush was a much-loved son, brother and boyfriend with a bright future ahead of him, which included moving in with his girlfriend and starting a new job. On the 24th of December 2023, as he looked forward to spending Christmas with his family and girlfriend, he was killed by someone he regarded as a friend, having done nothing to warrant the brutal violence inflicted upon him. Our thoughts during sentencing today, as they have been throughout the investigation, are with William, his family and girlfriend. Whilst we recognise that Dylan Thomas's sentence of a minimum life with a minimum of 19 years imprisonment will bring William back, we do hope that this outcome goes some way to allowing the family to grieve and help in some way with their heartbreak. I would like to reiterate our thanks to the community of Cardiff for its support during the investigation, and to William's family for bravely reading their victim personal statements in court today. Thank you.
We can only hope that William's friends and family have been able to find some modicum of peace with the justice that's been served, and are able to move forward with the memory of Will kept close to heart. And that's everything that I have for you in today's case. Thank you so much for watching this true crime video. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon if you want to see more true crime content just like this one. You can also find links to my socials in the description. And if you've got a case that you want me to cover, then go to requestacase.com and send it in there. And with all that being said, I will see you in the next case.